Alrighty. Computer's getting a little argumentative here. Doesn't want to do what I tell it to do. But we are here. And I don't know what day it is. I'm pretty sure it's Tuesday. I think it's Tuesday. So, Sunday night, game night. A lot of stuff was going on. Didn't get here in time to really do it. Needed to get to bed in time so I could get up for work the next day. Yesterday, I guess it was Monday, and went into work only to have to work a double shift on Surprise again. I was going to come on here anyway, but I realized I hadn't really done anything other than work. So I hadn't brainstormed or worked on any of the stuff that I wanted to do during the day. So no, I didn't have anything to offer, so I'm not going to jump on here just to be on here. And now I'm a little late today because I had the whole day to myself. I had the time to play, and play I did. So I came up with some world building stuff that it's a little all over the place because I've been ADD as all Hades today. I kid you not. I get up, I do something, I come back, I work on something, I get up, I do something. I can't remember half the time what I was in there. And then it's like, it took me 45 minutes to do one search for a thing that I needed to research because I kept getting sidetracked. It was really bad today. But the sidetracking led to some interesting things. So what I ended up really playing with today was taking a look at how I wanted to set the overworld, the divine realm that I wanted to build for my setting up. So I have the races that I want to do, and this is the ADD that kicked in today. I set out with the idea of setting out the major races and then doing half breeds between them was the goal, and I just got so sidetracked. So what I started out with was in the divine realm, you can start out as dwarf, elf, furbolg, which is sort of like a tiny giant. It's a half giant, essentially. It's sort of like if you were to breed a small giant and an elf together. That's sort of what you're getting there. Gnomes. So one dwarf, elf, furbolg, gnomes, harpies, kobolds, halflings, half-elves, humans, and a truly alien creature. I'm adapting the concept of the Umber Hulk into a playable race. So that was where I was going with some of that. My brain also wanted to play with the idea of taking a look at the idea of my dwarves being ones that sort of craft their own immortality by replacing parts of their body with metal or stone construct parts until you could get to a point where you have an ancient dwarf who is entirely a construct at that point. So they've become essentially like the Warforged. The gnomes I've built for this setting have a tendency to manipulate life forms and create medicine and those types of things by twisting and mutating life forms. And so they do something equivalent to what the dwarves do, except for they sort of splice in or I guess splice would be the right term, on additional or new grown replacement parts. So they are a constantly evolving collection of stitched together components, not stitched, but healed together components from different batches to keep themselves alive. The elves I've built are very similar to the ones from Eberron in which their focus is more along the lines of de-evolution, or not de-evolution, degradation of the living into an unliving being. So the elves of my setting, primary divine setting, are going to be something that just gradually shifts from elvish to something a little more vampiric. And then one of the things I really liked about one of the other settings I played when I was younger was the idea that dragons aren't a race or a creature of their own. They're an entity that evolves from lesser entities. So I have the option for races to become dragons. Now, the obvious one for that is the kobolds, because they are essentially dragon kin. But I debate any one of these options, the gnomish option, the option, the elvish option, and the dragon kind, could be something humans do. And it's just like, I think humans should be the ones that could do any of them, or all of them, some variant of them. And so I'm going through the different races. Furbolgs, as a race, I don't know how they would necessarily seek their own immortality. Half-elves, halflings, harpies, and the Umber Hulks are all things that I need to figure out their path towards immortality on. But I've also figured out some of the other potential monster types that I can have in the setting, and I've grouped them by similarity of type. So we have things like centaurs, satyrs, minotaurs, tabaxi, and tritons and merpeople. These are all half human, half animal beings. Now, tieflings, Aasimar, genasi, changelings, and shifters. These are also, tieflings are half demon, Aasimar are half angels. They're not half, they're partially each of each. The genasi are part genie. Changelings are half doppelgangers or part doppelgangers, and shifters are part were. And so they're, again, all part humans. And it's becoming really clear as I go through this that most of these things are some variant on part human, part something else. And then we get into the goblin kin, where we have goblins, hobgoblins, orcs, ogres, and bugbears. And these are less about how human they are, but could be seen as additions of hybridizing goblins with something. And then the reptilian individuals would be things like lizard folk, turtles, potentially kobolds again, Yonti, Gith, and Dragonborn. So I feel like they sort of group in a certain way. The idea of different degrees of reptilian nature for the reptiles, what are they, what's the degree you're altering from? Like the Gith are very much like elvish reptiles. The lizard folk are a little bit more of, they're sort of human reptiles. The dragonborn are part dragon, part humanoid, so they could be anything. The Yonti are human snake, and turtles are humanoid turtles, and so are tortoises, because they're not the same thing. And so it's not as clean with that group, but with the goblins, I could see something like a hobgoblin being a, well, I might be able to do something along that lines. Like an ogre would be a giant goblin breed. Orc might be a human goblin breed. Hobgoblins might be a elvish goblin breed. And bugbear might be a dwarvish goblin hybrid. Interesting. All right, so I'll have to think about that a little bit more. But in the long run, what I'm looking for is the roles and the races of each of these categories. And that's why I spent a fair amount of time playing with that earlier today. But I need to also think about the possibility of, like, so what do you get if you have a dwarf and a human? That one's pretty easy because there have been examples of that in past settings that I actually really like. What do you get when you do a human and an elf? Well, we already have half elves. They're pretty common. What do you get when you do a furbolg and a human? Don't know that one yet. And then what do you get if you do a human and a gnome? Don't know. There is a question at a certain point. What is a halfling? I feel like halflings or hobbits or halflings are oftentimes chunked in as their own race, but I feel like it may be more appropriate to see them as a halfway point. So they're not a half elf. They may be a half gnome. And are there harpy half breeds, or are harpies already a half breed? Kobold half-breeds shouldn't really be a thing. I think kobolds are sort of already a halfway point between humanoid and a reptile or dragon. And Umber Hulks are just so alien that there really shouldn't be half-breeding there. And I feel maybe harpies fall in that same category. So that was sort of what I was playing with. But as I was playing with that earlier today, I got to asking myself, what happens if you half-breed a gnome and an elf? What happens if you half-breed an elf and a dwarf? If you do an elf and a dwarf, is that a halfling? Maybe. I don't know. There's so many complicated ways to do this. And so it was like, it really started to get into a holy heck of a mess as I started to play with that. But I was having fun with it anyway. And then I did a little more touch up on some of the individual subsettings, the first tier subsettings, as I like to call them sometimes. So I took a look as I ran through the inflicted powers, and I did sort of build a list for mutations based off of a different role-playing system I have access to, and it has terms for mutations. So it's a table essentially of mechanical mutations. So the bad mutations are things like you have light sensitivity, reduced ability scores, you fatigue easily, you have a weak immune system, so you're vulnerable to poisons and disease. You have a physical change that happens to your body, like your eyes seal shut or something like that, slow your reflexes, and those types of things. These are all negative consequences of mutation. Then there's this sort of more normal line mutation where you have adaptations to hard circumstances. So you have things like improved reflex, or able to handle heavier loads, or resilience of some kind. And then you have night vision and tolerance for poisons and toxins. And then you have the good level mutations, which are things like acid touch, dermal armor, enhanced charisma, increased metabolic rate, natural attack, so like claws or things like that. And then you have like the amazing abilities, which are like the skin of a chameleon. And all of these things are essentially physical stats. They're physical changes. They're biologically entrenched new abilities. So these are, if I were to look at stats, these would be the strength, constitution, and dexterity stats. But there's also a set of information on things like psionic abilities, which is another category in the same resource that I was using here. And then you have things like bioweapon, control metabolism, heal, morph, rejuvenate, and transfer damage. Now, I think some of these might be better off shifted off into another category, because I feel like transfer damage is less about your constitution and maybe something a little bit more of like the wisdom or will check. But ESP under intelligence would be clairaudience, clairvoyance, empathy, mind reading, precognition, and psychometry, which is the ability to read history off of objects. Wisdom is telekinetic, for whatever reason they chose that one, and that's electrokinesis, kinetic shields, levitation, psychokinetic, photokinetic, and pyrokinetic. And photokinetic I thought was interesting. I was first thinking like, what, they can shape light? Photokinetic, as they put in this source, is actually being able to take a physical object and make it glow. I was trying to tip it, see if I could catch the light with it, see if I could pull that effect off. I think I might want to see if I can do some of these as that's sort of working there, but do them as special effects when I do some narration of some of the stuff I want to do. And then telepathy they put under charisma type category, which is contact another person's mind and speaking, essentially sending messages back and forth. Illusions, mind blast, mind shield, suggestion, and tire. So I'm going to go through this list a little bit more now. We have 4 categories of 6 each. So that should be, if my memory serves me correctly, 24 24 psionic abilities. I should be able to trim it down to 20. And I think I want to compile that down into intelligence, wisdom, and charisma specific scores, or psionic abilities. So they're the mental half of the abilities category. And then the physical half would be strength, dexterity, and constitution, which I'll dip back into the upper levels on the mutation tables, where they're far more likely to be physiological differences. So I've sort of got a whole category of things I can do for the superpowers now for my superhero setting. It's sort of roughed out. I mean, I still have to do a little bit more specifics on. I mean, we have the several categories, the 5 categories of abilities for the superhero category, not counting magical use. But you have characters with magical items. You have people with superpowers. So in this case, it'll be psionics and mutations. And then you have mutants who are monsters. So harpies, doppelgangers, trolls, and dragonborn specifically. And then you have inhumans. And I made a change here. Before I had it as shifters, genasi, tieflings, celestials. Now I had it set up that way because shifters are people who have a shape like a werewolf or a lion, some other like a werebear, werepanther in their family history, and so they inherit some of those traits. I'm moving that one out, and in its place, I'm going to put Dhampir, which is what you get when you take a vampire and you have them have a child with a human. And so these half vampires, essentially. And so that fits with the celestial, demonic, and genie-based creatures. So did shifters to a certain degree, but I'm setting shifters up partly into the category of demi-human changelings. I'm debating that because as it stands right now, I have elf, dwarf, triton, which is a mer person. Or I actually let me shift that right now. I can do the mer person should be something like a selkie instead of a triton. But I will grab some of the triton abilities for reference. And then the shifter, what I had before was the Yonti, which is the serpent-based beings. And I feel like neither the shifter nor the Yonti really fit that category well. I gotta figure that one out. That one may require a little more tinkering. But other than that, I think I've got everything worked out for playability on the superhero level. Maybe just building some individual adventures and an overarching story arc for the main course of the adventure. So build the railroad and the surrounding adventures, essentially. And then the Medusa setting, I did another adjustment there where before I had talked about doing a D20 with 5 categories into which it fell. I still have that one reserved, but I dropped the last one. I still want to do it in a time before the, I guess, before the Children of Stone are involved. So my character story that I built for this setting before I even was making it a gameplay setting was to have the Medusas with certain life qualities. So some of them would become inherit conditions of dwarfism and therefore be the little folk, the dwarves and gnomes and that sort of thing, and the halflings. So the halfling Medusas and the dwarf Medusas and the gnomish Medusas are just different forms of inherited conditions that breeds true in a parthenogenic race. And then you have a more fey type of creature that is not quite the same as the Medusa, but very similar. And they are more like the elves of the Medusas. Then you have the regular Medusa, which is mostly human. And then you have sort of like another category of Medusa, which I have sort of co-opted the Yuan-Ti categories for, and it sort of works. So those are the 4. On top of that, I also had the former petrified victims of Medusa return to some sort of life as a construct, so like a stone golem. And I was pretty sure that would work out all right, and it would still work. But for the most part, I just sort of said, I don't need that category. And adding it means I have to have it set at a certain time in my timeline of my novel. And it sort of spoils the novel to have them there. So I just removed them. And the D20 stats still work with 4 categories instead of 5. Funny thing about a number that's divisible by 5 and 4 is you can do 4 instead of 5. And so I changed that up a little bit. And that leaves the main abilities for the races as hexing, charming, poison, and petrifying. And then the last category, which I haven't really discussed much, I was debating how best to do this. Because the way this sort of broke up was that the way I want the setting to work has really mainly just 3 categories of special ability, with the option of chunking in a 4th. But 3 doesn't really fit as nicely into 20 as the others. So I did sort of chunk it off as 4. And the way this works is this is the zombie apocalypse setting that I was creating. So basically what you have is at some point, some monstrous entity arrived on the world, and it is a sort of parasite. And it's a amoeba-like parasite, except for it's an amoeba-like parasite that starts out almost microscopic and grows into a massive slime. And so what I'm looking for is something that you can infect another being with. So an infected creature does damage that infects another being. So at some point there's scratching or biting or something like that, and the wound is potentially infected. And then there's, as it gets inside the body, it drives the person it's infecting sort of mad, like rabies or something like that, gradually just decreasing your ability to function. And then at the next level out, it starts to, like, the person's still in there, just sort of trapped in this body that's painful and driving it mad, and the body's sort of acting on its own in some senses. The parasite has sort of taken over some functions and regurgitates more of its own mass to infect others with a bite, and chews at its fingertips so that it bleeds some of itself out. And as it gets more advanced, it can form claws and fangs out of its mouth, and its eyes glaze over, and it sees less visibly and more reacts to its environment through other senses. And then as it gets further, it becomes whole parts of the body are covered in spines and razors of this symbiotic creature. But parts of it that break off can't really survive outside of the host. It's only sort of opportunity is to be broken off in another potential host, and there's the chance for the infection to survive. But as you get further, you get to the point where you get a massive entity that can absorb other people who are infected and become sort of like a blended organism. And then eventually you get sort of the secret of the story is one of them is sort of getting to the point where they're the founder or sort of like the hive queen. And that central entity has a sentient, sapient mind. So it's a aware, thinking, speaking being. And if you become infected, you become a subject of that entity through the infection. And your mind is sort of dissolved, and then it just your body is the host to a slaved subject. So it's sort of like you got to think of it as the hive queen is sort of like the necromancer, and the parasites are sort of like the zombies that the necromancer raises, or the vampire and its thralls. That's essentially what we're building here. But here's the thing. The way I want this to play out, you have the ability to connect with the parasite as if it's a symbiont. And that symbiont and you, this is going to be more like Venom from the Spider-Man comics or the movie, where this is an entity where you can form a partnership with. There's a version of it that you, without necessarily having been infected or having survived an infection, have the ability to communicate with and partially control the parasites around you. So you can steal the little slave minds from the hive queen. So that's two types of powers we got here. The third one is a little bit tricky. And the third one was, you are the parasite. You're not the hosted infected, but maybe you don't know that. Maybe at some point you were attacked, and maybe at some point there was an attack and a person became infected with a parasite. But the infection, as it spread, induced such a fever that amnesia was induced. And so the infection and the host, neither of them after this battle know who is who. And as you spread, it becomes more and more clear that you're not diminishing, you're taking over. And so you're a parasite. And that lays a little bit of a fun foundation for what happens to you as a parasite if one of the other players can control you, turn you into a puppet. What about the hive queen? She could turn you into her puppet. What happens in all of these scenarios if you are the parasite infecting a host? And so that's three categories. And those are the three I'm really there for. Those are the ones that make the setting interesting. But mechanically speaking, there is sort of the question of, all right, so how do we get that on a D20? And if we're going to put that on a D20, you have to sort of split it by 2, 4, 5. You could maybe do like you can do subsets of that. You could do 8. You can do 10. Could you do 6? You might. 6 might be a little hard to do. No, 6 is a little tricky. Yeah, it's not an even split. But at any rate, I'm debating whether or not I want the last one. I mean, it just makes sense that one of them could be you're immune to infection. So category 4 would be immunity to infection, but I want that to be kind of rare. And so I would much rather have you are the ooze, you can control the ooze, or you can form a partnership with your ooze, be the 3 main categories. And then sort of like each one of those already has 5 numbers in the dice roll that would equal them. If I pull the immunity and pull 3 of its 5 and put 1 in each of the other categories, there will be 6 numbers for each of those 3 options. And then 2 numbers for immunity, which gives you that rarity again. I feel like I also potentially want you are the ooze to be more rare too. So I might end up taking 4 out of immunity and putting 2 into control and 2 into symbiosis. I think that may be the way I want to go. That leaves it with 1 for immunity and 5 for you are the ooze out of 20. That may be the better way to split the numbers on that. I'll think about that. 5, 7, 7, and 1. The odds of rolling an immune to the infection are so close to impossible that only on a, what is it, a 20%? So no, it's a 1 in 20. So I think that's 20. It's is that 5%? Yeah, you have a 5% chance of being immune. But anyway, yeah, so that's sort of one of the things I built up around this evening, or the last few days, as I had the chance to play around. And so I'm now really getting to the point where it's getting closer to storytelling with it, where I'm doing the actual adventures and events that are going on and adding background characters and events to participate in, as well as events that happen regardless of, so basically history, events to participate in, and the feel and narration of the settings. So the divine setting, the overarching setting at the top, I want to feel more like John Carter of Mars and Frank Herbert's Dune, because those are sort of some of my favorite science fiction settings. But I'm moving a little on some of that. I feel like I can do a little bit of a change to some of that. Give it its own flavor, its own substance. And then the superhero setting, looking for inspirations on that score, I think I'm looking at the possibility of like looking at Watchmen, looking at what's it called? Wild Cards, and looking at the Aberrant story setting and the X-Men, a little bit of DC. So like maybe Marvel Cinematic will be a better approach. Not so much the X-Men, but Marvel Cinematic movies. DC, I want to do the animated DC more than I want to do any movies or TV. Well, I haven't seen any of the new TV series very much, so I can't say for sure whether or not that's a category I want to abandon. But I feel like the mood inspiration for the Medusa setting is a little bit more in the genre of I want to say Dragon Riders of Pern, but that's a very loose connection. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. I don't know where the subtext of the flavor for that one came from. I'll have to think about that a bit. But I happen to think about it a lot here. You can probably come up with a couple sources for where the zombie apocalypse story is coming from. That's pretty straightforward. And then from there, I have some other settings I could play with. And some of this is actually making me think of a few other things. So like I've got the Medusa setting inspired around the idea of Medusa being a parthenogenic species of reptilian women. Another mythological species that is predominantly always referred to as being only females is harpies. Could I do a setting like that too? Or are the harpies in my setting multi-gender? We'll see. And then the question of kobolds, dragons, dragonborn, and their roles and everything. Can we explore that in its own setting? Probably. We got a little space to do that. Looking at the list of other creatures that I did, I mean, I'm reminded that one of the settings that I came up with early on for this multiverse was my satyrs and cyclopses setting. And stories of like goblin kind and how they relate to one another. I have a couple story ideas in that genre. It's just, and like one of my favorite books of all time artistically is Dinotopia. And I kind of want to do something like that. And so like just figuring out where some of that all fits in and figuring out the rough technology level, the roles of mortality in the overarching setting. Like, when you die, what do you do? So in some of this here, we have the idea of the main setting, the divine setting that the characters move through at first. If you go on an adventure and you're injured and you die, I don't necessarily want it to be the end of that character. I want it to be that the character who's died becomes a sort of spirit. They have their soul and their spirit, but they're just not able to reanimate their body. So I kind of want to set it up so that they still participate as a member of the party, but they don't have the ability to affect the physical world around them, but very minutely. And I want them to sort of have a reason to bring their fallen comrades' remains back to a healer to see if they can fix them up and pull their spirit and their soul back into their body, stitch them together through mystical means, and bring them back into the world. That is sort of what I want to do for the overarching setting. Now, the option for at a certain point of if you're a disembodied spirit and soul, you have the option of going to certain locations where you can be born into another world and become a living being on that other world again. I also kind of want to have the option of the angelic beings. Like the divine setting has sort of these lesser humans. If you're a human, elf, dwarf, or whatever, you're the main races, and then you're going to have these sprite-like or imp-like or otherwise not lesser but diminutive companion species, I guess. And they're the equivalent of being angels and demons that partner with the divine entities. But that's not divulged right out the gate. You don't necessarily understand that to be the case right away. And I kind of want the option for people to play angels and demons at a certain point. If you're going to start as a minor divinity, it doesn't necessarily make sense for you to devolve into an angel or a demon. But if you can be bound into a body and taken back out of the body, or cast your soul down into one of the smaller realms and live out a life there, and then after that life on that world, become one of these angelic beings, and then through living as an angelic or demonic being in that divine realm as a companion species, maybe reach a point where you gain enough power to ascend from that companion species into a full-blown divinity. I think that's sort of the path I want it to take. The divinities can pass from the divine world into the earthly realm. I guess if you pass away and you become a spirit, but you can't get back to your body, casting yourself through certain portals is what shatters you. I can kind of see that. I have to think about that a little bit more. This is back on that topic of how to shift between worlds thing. And I kind of want the idea to be that, like, I want the divinities to be able to be multiples of themselves at any given time, but you can only play one at a time. For a while, it was the thought process was you start out as a divine being, you get shattered, and you wake up on world one, and you're adventuring on world one until you hit a trigger point, and then we shift you over to world two, but you're shifting over to world two at the same time you arrived on world one. So the lives you're living on world one and two are parallel lives, not sequential. But the problem I have with that is you're not necessarily able to time things the right way for that to all work out. It's sort of like this, you don't get to take the knowledge of what you did in world one over to world two. If you do it in parallel rather than sequential. because you might think I've discovered the enemy has come down to the worlds too, and they're hunting us to steal our divine sparks, and we can take theirs as much as they can take ours. So it's a little bit of a game of Highlander here. You don't get to discover that, even though you've already discovered that. Like you don't discover that 3 months into living on World 1, shift over to World 2, and start from World 2 without that knowledge. That doesn't work if you're doing things in parallel. That only works if you're going sequentially. So the ability to shift your mind into one of your other vestiges that's a tricky one. I still got to figure that part out. Being able to shift over bodily is also an option, but I think that's going to be something more along the lines of find your way into Valhalla physically, and from Valhalla has a connection to at least 2 of those worlds. So you can leave Valhalla you can get into Valhalla in World 1 and leave it to go to World 2 physically. What's the equivalent of doing that mentally? And how do you do it while leaving your vestige behind? And not just like dropping it like a puppet and then expecting it to be okay for the 5 months you're over in the next world over. That's the part to figure out. That's the nut to crack. Ooh, we're 52 minutes in, so I should probably call it for tonight. No guarantees I'll be back tomorrow because they keep jumping on these extra hours for me. I'll give it a try. Again, I'll probably be aiming for 11 and succeeding at 11:15 to 11:30-ish. So I guess that's what we're going to aim for. And Friday night, I will probably be meeting up with some people in Manchester at the Makerspace. And then I believe this weekend I have a family gathering for some family birthdays to do. So there's going to be a little bit of a spot here and there where I won't necessarily be able to make it. But the goal going forward is to try to at least do a few nights a week. But we shall see. I will try for tomorrow. And even if I can't do a big update on something I've worked on tomorrow, I will at least stop by and share some ideas of other videos that I'm working on. Like the daytime videos, the reviews of movies and books and stuff. I should probably do something about that. So I think that should be what I aim for tomorrow. So thank you for joining me. Sorry I was gone for 2 days. So take care and good night. I feel guilty when I don't come on here like that. But